Hello, Happy Hermit here, and I have a true behemoth for you today, Roberto Bolano's 2666, essentially 5 books in one. Bolano wrote this as he was dying of liver failure. The book's publishing history is a postmodern tale in itself. Bolano envisioned this published as 5 separate volumes. There's rumors that this was intended as a first draft, and of other sections incomplete or lost. I find a lot of this information dubious, but what's interesting is all that lore doesn't decrease the book's respect with its readers, but enriches it. 2666 is already paranoid and indirect, playing heavily in symbols and having stories that contradict each other. Reading it becomes not so much following a plot line and a sort of interpretation exercise. What do you do when you're given too much? You have no choice but to reframe the story to allow you to think about it coherently. First, the book description. Quote, composed in the last year of Roberto Bolano's life, 2666 was greeted across Europe and Latin America as his highest achievement, surpassing even his previous work in its strangeness, beauty, and scope. Its throng of unforgettable characters include academics and convicts, an American sports writer, an elusive German novelist, and a teenage student and her widowed, mentally unstable father. Their lives intersect in the urban sprawl of Santa Teresa, a fictional Juarez, on the U.S.-Mexico border, where hundreds of young factory workers, in the novel as in life, have disappeared. End quote. I give the writer of this description a lot of credit for boiling down this enormous book in a relatively coherent way. It's not difficult in its language. It's not like Infinite Jest with its technical sections and footnotes, nor Gravity's Rainbow with its abrupt changes of perspective, nor Ulysses with its complex sentence structures and narrative experimentation. It's strictly the size of the story. You feel like you're inspecting an enormous beast one cell at a time, to the point of where it's incredibly difficult to understand. However, each section is pretty easy to understand on its own. The other difficult part is the part about the crimes, where Bolano is listing crime after crime after crime in explicit detail. It creates a numbing, disheartening effect, and is the centerpiece of the book. It's almost too effective. It makes the other parts seem far less meaningful in context. I had difficulty reading the last section, the part about Archamboldi, because going back to a more conventional narrative felt so anticlimactic. I'm glad I did. There's a strange grace to it, that after the most horrible things happen, we can get back to some version of a less brutal life. There's a grace to how Bolano ends 2666, after all the horrors and violence, with a story about ice cream. For context, a first Puckler is a German ice cream treat similar to a Neapolitan. Quote, allow me to introduce myself, he said. My name is Alexander First Puckler. The, how shall I say, creator of this ice cream, he said, was a forebear of mine, a very brilliant First Puckler, a great traveler, an enlightened man, whose main interests were botany and gardening. Of course, he thought, if he ever thought about it at all, that he would be remembered for some of the many small works he wrote and published, mostly travel chronicles, little books that are still charming today and, how shall I say, highly perceptive. His little books, despite their, how shall I say, botanical trappings, are full of clever observations, and from them one gets a decent idea of the Europe of his day, a Europe often in turmoil. And so he wrote and published, and in his own way, humbly, but in fine German prose, he raised his voice against injustice. He was interested in dignity and was interested in plants. About happiness he said not a word, I suppose, because he considered it something strictly private. What he never imagined was that he would be remembered for lending his name to a combination of 3 flavors of ice cream. A mysterious legacy, don't you think? End quote. This reminds me of what Pandora finds at the bottom of the box after releasing all the evils of the world. Yes, there is turmoil, but turmoil ends and leaves things like ice cream, gardens, simple delights. Also, that we are not in control of our legacies. That's for the world to figure out. All we can do is make what we make and live our lives the best we know how. Considering this is the last message from a man dying of liver failure, it's quite striking. I also find it as a reminder that the world is rich and full of things, and while it's important to look at the darkness, we should end with our gaze onto the light, rather than let the darkness consume us. It also emphasizes the strange effect literature has in 2666. Besides the violence, the secondary theme is literature and the arts having a transformative effect. It's not predictable. First, Pukler wrote gardening and travel pieces but ended up being known for an ice cream treat. In 2666, writing turns Nazis into Italian novelists. A book about geometry turns into a professor's expression of despair. A reporter's story about a boxing match transforms into an interview with a possible serial killer. A woman becomes a nationally renowned mystic through the powers of reading and story. But, at the same time, an artist becomes a madman and later dies through his art. Bolano presents a world where you choose either destruction or metamorphosis. Even though human nature is primed to try to keep things the same, we are always going to lose one or the other. As James Baldwin puts it, quote, "Most of us, no matter what we say, are walking in the dark, whistling in the dark. Nobody knows what is going to happen to him from one moment to the next or how one will bear it. This is irreducible, and it's true of everybody. Now, it is true that the nature of society is to create, among its citizens, an illusion of safety, but it is also absolutely true that the safety is always necessarily an illusion. Artists are here to disturb the peace." End quote. One way to interpret the violence of this book, especially towards women, is that it's a rejection of transformation. Maladjusted masculinity measures itself by its unchangingness, the goal to be unchanging and unmaneuverable. This attitude means you must be in complete control and can take no criticism and no suggestion of doing anything for anybody else. That impulse is so strong that it's preferable to cause chaos, to murder even, than to succumb to change. Violence, the ability to cause pain, harm, or death, is a way to make ourselves feel powerful. This violence is rarely against an equal, but towards someone weaker. You destroy something to feel whole. That illusion of strength is one way to fight against uncertainty, to keep a sense of personhood in a world of multiple conflicting forces. Early in the book, the professor Amalfitano gives an explanation of literature and art that serve as a thesis for the entire work. Quote, "The point is, your shadow is lost, and you momentarily forget it, and so you arrive on a kind of stage without your shadow, and you start to translate reality or reinterpret it or sing it. The stage is really a proscenium, and upstage there's an enormous tube, something like a mine shaft. From the opening of the mine comes unintelligible noises. Onomatopoeic noises, syllables of rage or of seduction or of seductive rage, or maybe just murmurs and whispers and moans. The point is, no one really sees the mouth of the mine. The shadowless intellectuals are always facing the audience, so unless they have eyes in the backs of their heads, they can't see anything. They only hear the sounds that come from the deep in the mine, and they translate or reinterpret or recreate them. Their work, it goes without saying, is of a very low standard." End quote. We're in a world where artists have lost their shadows, the shadow being a thin, portable version of the darkness at the bottom of the mine. This is a very imagistic explanation that even in the context of 2666, the listeners don't understand. But the first thing to realize is that this is not something that can be told literally. The sounds from the mines are sounds from the deep, instinctual utterances, but also the things that society tends to hold at arm's length, like the femicides of St. Teresa, a flood of death and violence that even the people inside it, at least at the beginning, don't talk about or acknowledge. At the same time, some powerful force persists, leaving death and dismemberment in its wake. Elsewhere, Bolano discusses how there's a big difference between how we treat violence in society versus outside it. One example being Jack the Ripper. He did not cause panic because he killed prostitutes. Prostitutes died all the time in 19th century Europe. He got famous because he was a literate killer who was taunting the police. He also discussed this in context of slavery. Quote, "No doubt about it, society was small. Most human beings existed on the outer fringes of society. In the 17th century, for example, at least 20% of the merchandise on every slave ship died. By that I mean the dark-skinned people who were being transported for sale to Virginia, say, and that didn't get anyone upset or make headlines in the Virginia papers or make anyone go out and call for the ship captain to be hanged. But if a plantation owner went crazy and killed his neighbor and then went galloping back home, dismounted and promptly killed his wife, 2 deaths in total, Virginia society spent the next 6 months in fear, and the legend of the murderer on horseback might linger on for generations." End quote. A purpose of narrative is to bring society's attention to problems because then society can choose to respond to them. In the example of the murder on horseback, that legend would get passed around and referred to whenever a landowner started going around the bend. Society has rules and protections that, when they're broken, it's like an immune response occurs sociologically. Stories get spread, and while there is no guarantee against violence, in society there will be a counter-response to violence that breaks the rules. Outside of society, there are no rules. One irony in St. Teresa, where the femicides are occurring, is that one set of crimes, a man desecrating Catholic churches, is being pursued because it's an in-society crime. However, women in St. Teresa can be raped, killed, and discarded regularly with little concern because they are out of society. The attitude isn't even that they deserve it, it's more of indifference, because these working-class women don't generally have stories told about them. There's little concern with how they live or die, no different than the slave ships of early Virginia. 2666 is written like a serial killer novel, except there is no serial killer. The killers are just men who treat women like careless children treat playthings. You break one, you wear one out, and you get a new one. You feel frustrated or unhappy? Just smash a toy. These women will become statistics, not stories. The only story they get is, this is just how the world is. So these murders barely get investigated. Half the time the bodies remain unidentified. Tests and evidence go missing. And this is where the lack of a shadow comes in, because we have several people come through St. Teresa capable of creating and publicizing narratives. We have a set of literary critics, professors, an author, a magazine reporter, and more coming through St. Teresa, and these murders aren't hidden. The closest we get to any of them telling a story is Fate, a reporter sent to cover a boxing match, gets interested but ultimately sidetracked in interviewing the phony serial killer rather than talk to any of the victims. As a side note, I don't doubt Klaus Haas probably killed someone, but the idea that he's responsible for all the killings is clearly false, especially as they continue after he's under arrest. These are the people who don't have shadows. They could not begin to tell the stories of these murders because their lives have been comfortable. You need a piece of that darkness to be able to communicate that darkness to others, and most of these characters have never had any. The critics start getting cheap thrills from petty violent acts. The professor can only hang a philosophy book in the wind. The reporter gets sidetracked off the real story to a diversion. And the author, well, he's at the end discussing ice cream. St. Teresa isn't a story of a bad person doing bad things and being brought to justice. It is the story of a whole set of people who do not live under the light of justice at all. They live in illegal trash dumps and do under-the-table factory work, and when they go missing, almost nobody notices. This art without shadows has many names. Wallace Stegner calls it the sundial theory of art, which would count no hours but the sunny ones. Milan Kundera calls it kitsch, by which he means the absolute denial of anything profane. The problem with it is that it acts like an opiate, calling you into these synthesized worlds and rejecting the real one. When you have a population that won't look at anything ugly, problems fester, because there's a part of the population that quickly learn that if you behave ugly enough, you will turn invisible and be able to get away with anything. But no matter how hard you try, you can't completely divorce yourself from reality. There is an interconnectedness that persists. Quote, "At that same moment, the Santa Teresa police found the body of another teenage girl, half buried in a vacant lot in one of the neighborhoods on the edge of the city, and a strong wind from the west hurled itself against the slope of the mountains of the east, raising dust and a litter of newspaper and cardboard on its way through Santa Teresa, moving the clothes that Rosa had hung in the backyard, as if the wind, young and energetic in its brief life, were trying on Amalfitano's shirts and pants and slipping into his daughter's underpants and reading a few pages of the Testamento Geometrico to see whether there was anything in it that might be of use, anything that might explain the strange landscapes of streets and houses through which it was galloping, or that would explain it to itself as wind." End quote. Angst, unease, anxiety. These are the responses to repression. We tend to overstate the effectiveness of censorship with repression. We know books like Lady Chatterley's Lover mostly because of censorship. Otherwise, it might have sunk into obscurity like other early 20th century romances of similar quality. The most effective form of repression is social. Certain ugly things that we all don't talk about because they're too uncomfortable, too difficult, too depressing, or whatever other reason makes them unmarketable. In a world where true crime podcasts proliferate, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that talks about the wife beaten to death by her husband, or the opiate addicts ODing in the streets, or the drunk driving hit and run. People won't pay to hear these stories, not on a large scale. Notoriety makes something interesting, thus causing it to be discussed more. If you want to make something disappear, make it unpleasant and boring. Curiously, removing the ugliness and difficulty from everything removes value. In a world where everything is pretty and the sun always shines, nothing is truly beautiful, because nothing is human. It can no more nourish the soul than images of food can feed the stomach. We can become metaphysically anorexic, not realizing we're starving as our lives shrink to meaningless husks. If your whole life is just a series of diversions, it raises the question, what is it you're diverting yourself from? Fate, a reporter, has a discussion with Charlie Cruz and Santa Teresa. Quote, the end had become somewhere. Charlie Cruz didn't care where, maybe in the churches when the priests stopped celebrating the Mass in Latin, or in families when the fathers, terrified, believe me, brother, left the mothers. Soon the end of the sacred came to the movies. The big theaters were torn down and up went the hideous boxes called multiplexes, practical, functional. The cathedrals were felled by their wrecking balls of demolition teams. Then the VCR came along. A TV isn't the same as a movie screen. Your living room isn't the same as the old endless rows of seats, but look carefully and you'll see it's the closest thing to it. In the first place, because with videos you can watch a movie all by yourself. You close the windows and you turn on the TV. You pop in the video and you sit on a chair. First off, do it alone. No matter how big or small your house is, it feels bigger when no one else is there. Second, be prepared. In other words, rent the movie, buy the drinks you want, the snacks you want, decide what time you're going to sit down in front of the TV. Third, don't answer the phone, ignore the doorbell, be ready to spend an hour and a half to 2 hours or an hour and 45 minutes in complete and utter solitude. Fourth, have the remote control within reach in case you want to see a scene more than once, and that's it. After that, it all depends on the movie and on you. If things work out, and sometimes they don't, you're back in the presence of the sacred. You bury your head into your own chest and open your eyes and watch. End quote. Charlie defines the sacred as allowing something outside yourself to deeply connect with you. With that connection comes the capacity to be altered. Anything can be sacred. Religion is a common sacred object, as its whole purpose is to reach outside of ourselves. But art, nature, film, life itself, anything we open ourselves to and allow in, that is what is sacred to us. As Emerson, the great transcendentalist, said, though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us, or we find it not. He's pointing out the necessity of letting things sink in, of getting away from the idea of seeing everything as items to be merely consumed, then discarded. The human soul is a cathedral that only turns into a black tomb if you let no light in. The ones who keep the light shut out, they are feral ones who lack the facilities to respond intelligently. They can only respond like a toddler, with their fists and bodies, and only know anxiety, fear, and hunger. To be clear, neither the book nor I are claiming literature stops violence. However, it does lessen mindless behavior like beating someone to death for burning the eggs. Also, the kind of stories told are a big indicator of values. St. Teresa's narratives are almost exclusively oral. Only one character there actively reads, and he's called a faggot for doing it. But lots of stories are passed around orally. When the written word is out of the question, tales, rumors, music, and television take its place. Because of this, the stories become simpler, as writing allows us to retain more information than audiovisual input. Consider the jokes told by the police in Santa Teresa. Quote, at the same time of day, cops at the end of their shifts met for breakfast at Trejo's, a long coffee shop like a coffin with few windows. There they drank coffee and ate huevos rancheros, or ate eggs and bacon, or scrambled eggs. And they told jokes. Sometimes they were monographic, the jokes, and many of them were about women. For example, one cop would say, what's the perfect woman? She's 2 feet tall, big ears, flat head, no teeth, and hideously ugly. Why? 2 feet tall so she comes right up to your waist, big ears so you can steer her, a flat head so you can have a place to set your beer, no teeth so she can't bite your dick, and hideously ugly so no bastard steals her away. Some laughed. Others kept eating their eggs and drinking their coffee, and the teller of the first joke continued. He asked, why don't women know how to ski? Silence. Because it never snows in the kitchen. Some didn't get it. Most of the cops had never skied in their lives. Where do you ski? In the middle of a desert. But some laughed. And the joke teller said, all right, friends, what's the definition of a woman? Silence. And the answer, a vagina surrounded by a more or less organized bunch of cells. And then someone laughed. An inspector, good one, Gonzalez. A bunch of cells, yes, sir. And another joke, international this time. Why is the Statue of Liberty a woman? Because they needed an empty head for the observation deck. And another, how many parts is a woman's brain divided into? That depends. Depends on what, Gonzalez? Depends on how hard you hit her. End quote. These jokes go on for several pages. Partially it's there to show how the police are part of the culture that devalues women and anything feminine. We see examples of them committing assault and much worse elsewhere in this chapter. It's interesting how there's a defensiveness that tends to come up when you comment on this kind of joking, as if you're spoiling the fun by taking things too seriously. Yet, these policemen are telling these jokes in a city where a woman's dead, mutilated body shows up daily. It's not the joke that's the problem, it's the attitude behind the joke. At the end of this flood of jokes, I'm left wondering, why is it important to have women be less valuable? There's been a lot of discourse on this, but one part of it that gets missed is that misogyny isn't an intellectual thing. It's basically the psychology of bullying. It's this idea that the world is for the strong. You prove you're strong by inflicting your will on someone weaker than you, therefore you do not want to be seen as weak. Emotional tenderness, needing anything, showing fear or sadness, having any sort of connections, especially to other weak people, caring too much, these all threaten getting yourself labeled as weak. And in a king of the mountain world, being seen as weak is enough, because that puts a target on your back, and when everybody else is coming for you, it doesn't matter how strong you are, you will be beaten down. All this gets laced with rage, because anger is the only acceptable emotion. With such a mindset, thinking too much is dangerous because it gets you in touch with these repressed feelings, but also because it slows the instincts. This is a world where it's preferable to be a murderer or wife-beater than to be seen as weak. 2666 points out the difficulty in defining violence, whether it's a boxing match, an assault, a murder, an artist cutting off his own hand, or the territory is too vast for definitions, we're just left with observation. Violence does seem to be a bit like littering. Some of it is inevitable, but left uninhibited, it tends to snowball into uncontrollable proportions. Education, vigilance, and community seem to hold it back. One thing about Santa Teresa is there doesn't seem to be much community there at all. You get scene after scene with the police questioning the public about both victims and perpetrators, and nobody seems to know them, or they only know them vaguely. Towards the end of the book, a protest reaction starts to form, and with that, the police looking to find a scapegoat. They arrest one man who couldn't possibly be doing all these murders. So far, that hasn't stopped the protest movement, which seems to be gaining its own momentum. There's a slight hopefulness I have just in the structure, considering that maybe this is the whole story of the Santa Teresa femicides, because that part of the narrative ends just as public attention focuses on it. Violence and significance have a relationship with each other. Significance doesn't necessarily ward you against violence, but it creates repercussions when it happens. Part of the struggle in 2666 are the horrors of insignificance, where you can be killed and discarded and nobody really cares. It's interesting that after all this darkness, we end with ice cream almost as if the readers get a treat for doing something difficult. It's a reminder that the things that outlive us are often the small, gentle things. When someone is significant because they cause fear, well, once they die, they tend to get forgotten because there's nothing to fear anymore. Making yourself into a monster, also, turns into a double-edged sword. Become big enough of a threat, the community turns against you, and it becomes the monster versus the mob. That's the price of notoriety. Personally, I leave the book wanting more than ever to have a peaceful, quiet life, and to be part of a society that rewards such things. I like the world that remembers people who write about gardens and ice cream more than people who act like beasts. This world can be a sophisticated, civilized place where we lift each other up, or it can be a mud pit battle where we are all trying to drag each other down. I know which I prefer. Happy reading!